if you are getting the quarterly newsletter, the hard copy quarterly newsletter in the mail, that means you either in the past have paid your dues or are paying your dues now. If you're not paying your dues, again, we need that annual $45 to help cover the cost of that publication. And I will tell you, we all get tons of emails, at least many of us do, most of us do every day. A lot of it's junk, obviously. We would prefer to continue to have a printed newsletter come out quarterly. Our President Emeritus, Marianne Hackett, is our editor of that. And every time I get it, and I'm not just blowing smoke, every time I get it and read an article or two, they're just excellent. They're just excellent articles. Thank you, Marianne. And they're not the same articles that we post. A couple of times it might have been an overlap, but most of the time there's not. So, and you can read it at your leisure. You don't have to, look at your emails every day. So anyway, if you haven't paid your dues for a while, $45 I think it is now. Next time it comes out, it'll have an envelope in there. Please, just write a check and help us keep that going. We also, I just want to remind people, we have new videos posted from our, I think it's our December and February luncheons. We're also noticing a big uptick in the number of people that are looking at the videos, which is very gratifying. The most viewed video is Father Altman's Why You Can't Vote Democrat if you're Catholic, or whatever it was. Very controversial, 36,000 views. And they're still climbing. I think the second most viewed is about 10,000, and that was a COVID related. I think it was COVID, I'm not remembering. But anyway, and as people come, I think they see other speakers that they are interested in and click on them and so forth. So all of our speakers eventually get on the internet. Joe Curry, our videographer, is in charge of that and does a wonderful job for us. So if you have time, or if you're interested, and have time, visit the website. That's Catholic Citizens TV, right? Yeah, Catholic Citizens TV on YouTube. And by the way, one of the most recent ones we did was the talk given at our annual banquet by Austin Roos. Many of you know Austin Roos. Many of you were at the banquet. It was an incredibly timely and good presentation, and the gist of it was that this is a great time to be a Catholic, because we're, number one, surrounded by true saints, and number two, we're challenged in our faith and have to defend it, and that's good for all of us. So I recommend the Austin Roos remarks. I've seen many videos of him giving versions of this same talk. It's also based on the book he wrote. This is the best by far that we were very fortunate to have him for our speaker. It's the best by far that I've seen of that. Also, and this is the first anyone's going to hear of this, our annual banquet in the fall is September 12th. I think it's a Thursday, so save the date. Our guest honored speaker is Bishop Strickland. Yeah. We don't know where Bishop Strickland will be by then, but we're taking a chance that he'll be worth hearing. And the topic generally, I don't know if this will be the actual title, but the topic is something along the lines of lessons learned, convictions hardened, something like that. But if you're following him at all these days, he's obviously given a lot of thought to what he went through and what he's going through. And I think it'll be a great talk. And I also urge you, in that regard, to get your reservation. We don't have the ticket site up yet, but we're going to put it up soon. Just keep watching. We'll announce it when we have it up. Our chaplain is still recovering, so we don't have a chaplain today. But in sort of his honor, I propose that we pray the Angelus. That's what Father Finelli would typically do, and then our blessing. So. I got a copy of it, and I should know it. Yeah. The angel of the Lord, the Holy Spirit. keep Father Finelli in our prayers. We have visited with him, some of us have visited with him. He's clearly still recovering. I don't know when, if at all, he'll be able to resume his chaplaincy with us, but we're hoping he will. And so keep him in your prayers. And now let's say a blessing. Bless us, O Lord.
In thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy body, Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you. It's always a challenge, practically always, to introduce some of these speakers that we have because they just have such an incredible life story, and I'm not going to pretend I'm going to go through the entire chronology of the speaker. But we did post it on the website, and if you're interested, not only in his background, his educational background and so forth, but the incredible output of articles and books that he's published. It's quite amazing, and I can vouch, I don't pretend to have read even most of them, but I have read several of them, and they are never a disappointment. Dr. Quash-NEV-ski, and I apologize for mispronouncing his name all this time, actually was born in Arlington Heights but raised in New Jersey, and very amusingly recites on his website that he attended an all-boys Catholic school in New Jersey where he got exceptional training in the humanities and poor to non-existent religious instruction. I think we can all kind of appreciate that. Then again, I'd be interested to know exactly what was going through his head as he continued his education. He went off to Georgetown University for a single year. Then he started over at Thomas Aquinas College in California, from which he received a BA of Liberal Arts in 1994. And then again, amusingly, the way he puts it, not having had his fill of Washington, D.C., he earned an MA and a Ph.D. in philosophy from the Catholic University of America. Taught at the International Theological Institute in Austria for a while, and taught music for the Franciscan University of Steubenville's Austrian program. Now, the next part of his resume is quite interesting because you may recall we had the current head of, well, he then went on to found, with others, he went on to found Wyoming Catholic College, and we had, who's the head of?
Kevin Roberts. Roberts, Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, Roberts, as a speaker, and most recently at our annual banquet last year, we had Kevin Roberts. Kevin Roberts is making a huge impact, I think, supporting a program that if and when Donald Trump gets elected, they'll be ready to go on day one with an attempt to rein in the so-called deep state. And I don't think he's the only one working on that, but the Heritage Foundation has been very involved in that. In 2018, left Wyoming Catholic College to pursue a career as a freelance author, public speaker, editor, publisher, and composer. And again, if you look at his body of his work, he's prolific in all of those fronts. The two books that came to our attention and that led to his invitation to speak here are the ones he's offering for sale today. The first one came out in 2021, True Obedience in the Church, A Guide to Discernment in Challenging Times. And then the second, which seems like an elaboration of the first, Bound by Truth, Authority, Obedience, Tradition, and the Common Good, which was just published in December. And as I've been telling many of you, we try to get speakers who are speaking to issues that are challenging for us as Catholics, and I can't think of a more challenging issue than trying to figure out what, as Catholics, as devout Catholics and practicing Catholics, what we're required to listen to and what we're not required to listen to or not take as seriously. And so I'm very glad for the guidance of these books, and I now welcome Dr. Kwasniewski.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that good introduction. And it's good to be back. I enjoyed the last time I came to speak to your organization. That was in downtown Chicago at the Union League Club some years ago. The time flies. But anyway, it's good to be back. Every century or two, the Church is confronted with a situation that is fundamentally new, something not seen before that has to be dealt with on its own terms. Catholics are always in possession of principles they can fall back on, but this new situation has no exact parallel in earlier times, no easy equivalency that would permit a formulaic response. When Arianism arose in the 4th century and spread like wildfire, including among the episcopacy, the Church was facing a state of emergency and had to respond accordingly. Humanly speaking, it was a close call. As St. Jerome famously said, the whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian. But equally new was the sudden and violent arrival of Islam, which swept away many of the most ancient, even original Christian communities in North Africa and Asia Minor. Another unwelcome novelty was the so-called pornocracy of the Dark Ages around the turn of the millennium, when the Pope's chair in Rome was bought and sold by pimps and prostitutes. If you don't believe me, just look it up. Then there was the Great Western Schism, when at one point 3 rivals claimed to be Pope, each with the backing of cardinals, bishops, and secular rulers. The Protestant revolt, too, though it was prepared for by a couple of centuries of rumblings, burst onto the scene as something unprecedented in the severity of its rejection of the Catholic tradition and its rapid multiplication of man-made doctrines. Church history is nothing if not full of surprises, of hair-raising crises, razor-thin escapes, devastating tragedies, and altogether unexpected resurrections. I maintain that the crisis after the Second Vatican Council must be seen as one of these fundamentally new situations. If St. Jerome were alive today, he might well say, "The whole Church groaned and was astonished to find itself modernist." Indeed, this crisis is greater than any that came before, because, to use Pope St. Pius X's exact phrase, modernism is the collection of all heresies. Omnium haeresion conlectum. And this modernism, in a soft and elegant form, though sometimes also with the jackhammers of iconoclasm, established itself in all the seats of learning and power. The age we are passing through is characterized by an arrogant rejection of centuries of church tradition, of historical rites, customs, monuments, laws, even settled dogmas and morals, called into question not by raving, wild-eyed reformers at the margins of civilization, but by cardinals, bishops, and even popes, with countless sympathizers at every level of the church. So great is the rupture that occurred in the 60s and 70s, as known to those who experienced it or have studied it subsequently, that there are still days when one can find it hard to believe that the so-called liturgical reform actually happened, or could have happened. For it should strike any calm observer as the most freakish betrayal of Catholicism in the entire history of the Church. The scale of the disaster beggars the imagination. This is also why certain coping mechanisms, like there's always confusion after a council, or we've had rough times before, are so weak and unconvincing. We have not been here before. We are in terra incognita, in the fearful unknown. We can't always interpret what we encounter with reference to ancient paradigms because it doesn't always align. Sometimes we have to figure things out for the first time. There is a first time for every major error in Christian history, and the error of our day, the rejection of tradition as good, right, normative, trustworthy, and providential, is an error that never existed before in this naked, austere, unmitigated form. As a consequence, our crisis raises questions about authority and obedience, for the simple reason that the revolution that took place and rapidly turned itself into the ecclesiastical establishment was initiated and consolidated by so-called authorities who claimed the unquestioning allegiance or obedience of all subordinates. Just as every earlier major crisis in church history led to the clarification of certain hitherto ambiguous or underdeveloped concepts, so too our crisis will eventually lead, and indeed has already begun to produce, a far better, more realistic understanding of church authority, especially the nature and limits of the papal office, and the corresponding virtue of obedience. There will come a time when the laity and parochial clergy will no longer be expected to swallow absurdities, while an abusive clericalism consumes the church's inheritance and replaces it with nothing of value. The question of the relationship of authority to obedience is central to our present situation, and that is why it must be addressed. Let there be no mistake about it. Properly understood and lived, obedience is a supreme virtue modeled by Christ himself. Our Lord and the saints practiced obedience, and so must we. A rebellious mentality is foreign to Christianity and to natural ethics. However, because tyrants, manipulators, and abusers of all sorts have freely taken advantage of habits of obedience, it has acquired a bad reputation. So much so that if you search for the term obedience on Google, all the results will be about dog training. It is time to rehabilitate the virtue by looking carefully at what it is and isn't. True obedience is never blind or unconditional, much less Pavlovian. It must be based on truth and charity, in the sense that we must be commanded to do what is truly good and for the sake of growing in love for the good. This is why it is not obedience that comes absolutely first, but truth and charity. Obedience is beautiful because, if I might use a homely metaphor, it glues the obedient person to God's goodness and truth and prevents him from coming unstuck. That is the whole point of it. Hence, demands for obedience that flow from error, falsehood, hatred, envy, or any other evil foundation are destructive and should be resisted in proportion to the damage they are causing or threatening to cause. If one has a serious and well-founded doubt about whether a particular human command is compatible with divine, natural, or ecclesiastical law, one should not obey it. One should suspend one's obedience. Now, authority, any and all authority, civil or ecclesiastical, is born to serve and promote the shared good of many. That is what we call the common good, a good that many people share in without depleting it, such as peace, justice, and religion. If a particular wielder of authority deploys his office overtly against the common good, then that command lacks moral binding power. The Church's common good is the divine life of Jesus Christ, her head, and the divinization of souls by the sacramental life and prayer. Crucially, the traditional liturgy is inherent to the Church's common good. Why? Because the time-honored rites of the Church are not merely human works, but works conjointly of God and men, of the Church moved by the Holy Spirit. The traditional liturgical worship of the Church, what is called her lex orandi, or law of prayer, is a basic, normative, stable expression of her creed, or lex credendi, and cannot be contradicted or abolished or heavily rewritten without rejecting the Spirit-led continuity of the Catholic Church as a whole. Only two groups have ever rejected the traditional lex orandi: the Protestants, who did so because they openly dissented from the creed it expressed, and the modernists, who maintained that, as the meaning of the creed perpetually evolves, so too should the prayer that reflects it. In reality, we know from Pius V's Quo Primum that the classical Roman rite, canonized after the Council of Trent, contains and transmits the Catholic faith, as do all venerable Christian rites, Eastern and Western, and as such cannot be abolished or abrogated. Rather, it remains a permanent treasure and testimonial, guaranteed to Latin Rite clergy and laity in perpetuity. We must be absolutely clear about this. Any attack on the traditional Latin Mass is an attack on the providence of God the Father, who guided his church to develop and exalt this liturgy for the better part of her 2,000-year pilgrimage on earth. It is a rejection of the work of Christ, the King and Lord of history, who is adored in it. A blasphemy against the fruitfulness of the Holy Ghost in the Church's life of prayer. A stance against the unanimous practice of every age of the Latin Church, of every saint, council, and pope prior to the 20th century. A rejection of the dogmatic confession of faith contained in this traditional liturgy as it organically developed over 2 millennia. A rejection of the communion of the Western saints who share a common lineage and patrimony of ecclesiastical worship. Because of the tight connection between prayer and creed, history and providence, it follows that abolishing or prohibiting or working against the immemorial Roman rite is a notorious and damaging attack on the Church's common good. This is why Pope Francis's attempt in Traditionis Custodes to restrict and eventually repeal the traditional Roman rite embodies an un-Catholic, indeed anti-Catholic point of view. As a matter of fact, it is love for the office of the Pope and for the Pope's immortal soul that moves us to denounce this abuse of papal authority against the good of the faithful. The moment tradition is proscribed, so too is the Church's substantive continuity over the ages, and with it, the basis of ecclesiastical authority itself, since, after all, the episcopacy and the papacy are themselves transmitted to us by tradition. It's like sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. But are ordinary Catholics capable of recognizing when authorities are acting against the common good? Do we have the right to make the judgment that a pope or a bishop has gone astray? The answer is yes. In the words of a 2014 document from the International Theological Commission, this is not a magisterial body, but it's a Vatican body. Quote, the sensus fidei fidelis, the sense of the faith, sensus fidelium, sometimes it's called, confers on the believer the capacity to discern whether or not a teaching or practice is coherent with the true faith by which he or she already lives. The sensus fidei also enables individual believers to perceive any disharmony, incoherence, or contradiction between a teaching or practice and the authentic Christian faith by which they live. Alerted by their sensus fidei, individual believers may deny assent even to the teaching of legitimate pastors if they do not recognize in that teaching the voice of Christ, the Good Shepherd. Unquote. Note this language. Even our legitimate pastors, pope, bishop, local pastor, fail to speak with the voice of the Good Shepherd when they impose disharmony, incoherence, or contradiction on the faithful. It was none other than St. Thomas Aquinas who famously said that unjust laws are acts of violence rather than laws, wherefore such laws do not bind in conscience. If we are convinced that something essential, something decisive in the faith is under attack from the Pope or any other pastor, we may and must refuse to do what is being asked or commanded, refuse to give up what is being unjustly taken away or forbidden. Any penalty or punishment meted out by the revolutionaries for so-called disobedience to their illicit requests or commands would itself be illicit, having no force. Canon law encapsulates the most important principle in the pithy phrase, salus animarum suprema lex. The salvation of souls is the supreme law. It is for the salvation of souls that the entire structure of ecclesiastical law exists. It has no other purpose than to protect and advance the sharing of the life of Christ with mankind. There can be situations of anarchy or breakdown, corruption or apostasy, where the ordinary structures become impediments to, not facilitators of, the Church's mission. In these cases, the voice of conscience dictates that one should do what needs to be done in prudence and charity for the achievement of this sovereign law. Consider the sheer spiritual power of the traditional Mass. Over the years, I've heard from or read accounts of many priests whose discovery of the ancient rite has transformed their priesthood and their entire spiritual life, renewing their youth like the eagles. It's amazing the number who go through this conversion experience. In some cases, they reach a point where they admit before God, I wish I could do this all the time. Or even, I can't do the modern rite anymore. They have found a pearl of great price and are ready to sell everything to buy the field where it lies buried. Sometimes this conversion story has a happy ending. For instance, a bishop appoints a priest as a Latin Mass chaplain or puts him in charge of a rural shrine. Sometimes, alas, especially in the current climate, it has a tragic ending. Priests have been sent into early retirement or even penalized and suspended for their principled adherence to the Church's tradition. Do you ever hear about a priest starting with the traditional Latin Mass and then discovering the greatness of the Novus Ordo and moving over more and more to it until he offers it exclusively? Until he has a longing in his heart and in his hands to offer just the Novus Ordo, even to the point of suffering for it and possibly losing everything. Once in a blue moon, one hears of a traditionalist priest who enters the diocesan presbyterate and alternates between the two rites for pastoral reasons, but never the spiritually transformative experience that I described. To me, this says more about the realities we are dealing with than 1,000 documents from the Vatican. We know, moreover, that it is not only priests and religious, but in far greater numbers, the lay faithful, who find their encounter with the traditional liturgy of the Church utterly transformative. The testimonials are now impossible to keep track of. There are so many of them online and in print. One Christmas day, as I gazed out from the choir loft at all of the families jammed into pews brimming over with children, and the sanctuary covered with candles, poinsettias, and pine trees, and as I followed the awesome beauty of a solemn high mass clothed in gold vestments and the otherworldly music of chant, using the same prayers, antiphons, readings, and ceremonies that the Roman Church has used for well over 1,000 years. Seeing all this, it was brought home to me with renewed force that any attack on this glorious patrimony and on the faithful who love it is and cannot be other than satanic. The sooner and better we grasp this, the sooner we will see that our response must be the total repudiation of Traditionis Custodes and the follow-up documents based on it. Bishops who accept and implement the motu proprio and the Dicastery for Divine Worship's responses align themselves with the father of lies. Priests who do not continue to find ways, both open and clandestine, to offer to Catholics the faith-nourishing, life-changing, religion-preserving treasures of the Church make themselves complicit in the robbery of the people of God. The greatest grace of this present moment will be the awakening of many from slumber about the issues that are really at stake, beneath surface squalls over so-called preferences and tastes and opinions. Let's not mince words. I'm not mincing words. The enemies of tradition would rather see a shortage of priests than an abundance of Latin Mass priests. Am I not right about that? They would rather see monasteries and convents go into hospice and shutter their doors than see them revitalized with religious who joyfully embrace tradition. They would rather have empty pews for the Novus Ordo than big sprawling families at the Tridentine Mass. Isn't that enough, and more than enough, to show that the inspirer of this anti-traditional onslaught is not God, but the devil? If the tradition of the Church is abundantly fruitful in graces and other spiritual goods, then we can see instantly why the enemy of God and of human nature would be so keen to see it suppressed and work sleeplessly as only angels can do, to move his human instruments to wage war against it. We all know what some of our co-religionists will say to us. Aren't we laity supposed to let ourselves be guided by the Pope and the bishops in regard to liturgical law? The answer is yes and no. Yes, in regard to all that concerns the devout, fitting and edifying celebration of the received and approved traditional rites of the Church. No, if that guidance, quote unquote, leads us to turn against that sublime inheritance which comes down to us from innumerable saints, a severance quite beyond the authority of any hierarch of the Church to effect or enforce. As Alan Phimister explains, quote, if the Church's rites are patristic monuments, ultimately traceable to the apostolic age, then they would quite naturally be immune to the vicissitudes of ecclesiastical positive law. As St. Jerome observed in such matters, each province may follow its own inclinations, and the traditions which have been handed down should be regarded as apostolic laws. Even if each of the particular elements of each tradition cannot be traced with certainty or even plausibility to the apostles themselves, the fact remains that as monuments to the Church's unwritten tradition, they cannot be abrogated by ecclesiastical authority, just as the authority of St. Athanasius, St. Augustine, or St. John Chrysostom cannot be abrogated. The divinely instituted matter of many of the sacraments, olive oil, wine, bread, is taken from the staple crops of the Mediterranean world, and the rites which transmitted them objectively form part of the witness to the deposit of faith. The Church cannot repudiate these things without repudiating herself and her Lord. Unquote. In other words, it is not just a reductively understood form and matter of the sacraments that constitute the tradition to be upheld, but the entirety of the rites that surround, interpret, and mediate the sacraments to the faithful, forming and informing them with the lex orandi's witness to the Catholic faith. These handed down rites are not incidental and indifferent constructs that each generation may judge, rewrite, or discard as it pleases, with the attitude of someone superior to what he evaluates. Instead, the generations that follow recognize with grateful humility their need to be formed by and the accompanying indebtedness to and duty towards the accumulated prayers and practices of their forefathers. That is simply the way Catholics have always acted and will always act. A frontal attack on that which was once central, unquestioned, exalted, jealously guarded, and always handed down in the life of the Church. I refer, of course, to the Roman Rite, as restored and canonized by Pius V in perfect fidelity to the dogmatic teaching of the Council of Trent, is in and of itself a dead giveaway that we are dealing with a staggering abuse of power that not only may but must be resisted for the good of souls. It is therefore not a burden but a privilege for us to be able to refuse our obedience to the designs of a renegade vicar of Christ who contradicts the truth and wounds the common good, and thus to give our unconditional allegiance to Christ our King, the Lord of history, the head and ruler of his Church, who will prepare in due time the deliverance and the restoration for which we long and pray. A Church that has no place of unquestioned honor for hallowed tradition, but only room for power and submission, is not the Church founded by Jesus Christ. The papacy, the hierarchy, all the structures that pertain to the visible society we call the Catholic Church exist from and for tradition. They themselves are part of what is handed down, together with the dogmatic and moral teaching, the liturgy and sacraments, the ascetical and mystical doctrine, all forming a mutually reinforcing totality. The Church exists to receive, preserve, and hand on this sum total of divine wisdom in the service of man's union with the triune God. Any attempt to defraud the faithful of this inheritance, to subvert it, deface it, suppress it, or mingle it with alien ideas and goals, as we see happening with the so-called synodal process epitomized in the Synod on synodality, counts as a move away from Christ and his Church, regardless of the specious legal forms in which it may be dressed. Such an attempt, and we have seen a record number of attempts during the past decade, but also cumulatively in the past 60 years, points to the existence of a parallel body that subsists parasitically on the Catholic Church, a man-made simulacrum or virtual schism masquerading as the Church. As Father Linus Clovis formulates it, Quote, "Modernism remaining within the Catholic Church has metastasized into the anti-church. It is self-evident that the Catholic Church and the anti-church currently coexist in the same sacramental, liturgical, and juridical space. The latter, the anti-church, having grown stronger, is now attempting to pass itself off as the true church, all the better to induct or coerce the faithful into becoming adherents, promoters, and defenders of a secular ideology." Unquote. Father Thomas Weinandy, no friend, incidentally, of the TLM, recognizes the peril under Francis. Quote, "What the Church will end up with, then, is a pope who is the Pope of the Catholic Church and simultaneously the de facto leader for all practical purposes of a schismatic church. Because he is the head of both, the appearance of one church remains while in fact there are two." Unquote. How is this situation even possible, you might ask? The theological tradition distinguishes between the Catholic Church as the mystical body and immaculate bride of Christ in her interior purity and heavenly glory, and the visible institution on earth, which, as our Lord illustrated in his parable of the wheat and the tares, is made up of both true Christians and false ones, so that the body of Christ and the body of the devil are, so to speak, commingled on earth until the end of time. This is a common theme in St. Augustine, and also taken up by Joseph Ratzinger. It should come as no surprise that it is entirely possible for the hierarchy of the Church at a given point in history to be occupied more by false Christians than by true ones. That is, to be occupied as it is today by those who do not coherently and consistently profess the Catholic faith in its dogmatic, moral, and liturgical fullness, but who are, to a greater or lesser extent, material heretics and material schismatics in regard to it. Or let us say, who carry with them, perhaps not even realizing it, the weight and the harm of the heretical ideas that are so plentiful in modern times, as well as schismatic tendencies drawing them apart from the great communion of the Church of all ages and of eternity. However did we reach this point? That is a long and complicated story. Ideas, practices, assumptions, attitudes emerging in the Protestant revolt, sharpened in the Enlightenment period, radicalized in the Age of Revolutions, and popularized in the secularism of the 20th century, have all played their part in reshaping the Catholic Church, sociologically speaking. Today, however, I wish to focus on what I will call Satan's masterstroke. There's an old adage, corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best is the worst. A well-known illustration of this adage is Aristotle's claim that monarchy, ruled by one virtuous man, is the best form of government, but its corruption, tyranny, ruled by one vicious man, is the worst form of government. Father John Sayward argues that Lucifer, the most beautiful of the angels, became the ugliest after his fall from heaven. Corruptio optimi pessima. St. Thomas Aquinas argues that obedience, the virtue of obedience, ranks particularly high among moral virtues because by it we are willing to slay our own will for God's sake. Since the will is our innermost principle of self-determination, to the degree we give up our will, we sacrifice ourselves, which becomes for the religious who professes a vow of obedience a holocaust or whole burnt offering. What is more, an act of virtue gains in merit when it is done not only because it is good in itself, but also because it has been commanded by another to whom we are subject. God, of course, as well as all superiors who stand in his place, such as rulers, fathers, and pastors. But if all this is true, obedience could also become a preeminent vice if rulers turn it towards evil. Corruptio optimi pessima. The devil uses three main methods for leading Christians away from the path of life. The first is the blunt method of open, bloody persecution. But the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christianity, and the church tends to spread all the more when openly persecuted. So the devil reaches for a second and more subtle method, internal moral corruption in the form of the 7 deadly vices. Yet even moral corruption is at times too repulsive and self-sabotaging in its outward manifestations to be successful. And so the devil lays his hands on the most subtle strategy of all, the twisting of obedience until it becomes a means of spiritual suicide or bureaucratic euthanasia. Historically speaking, this last campaign required a long preparation before it could be launched. The devil had to build up a skewed notion of blind obedience over the course of many centuries, because only in this way could the overthrow of Catholic liturgy, doctrine, morals, and culture be brought about. That is, the destruction had to come, or at least seem to come, from the Pope and the hierarchy so that it could be plausibly presented and accepted as God's will, imposed on people who would already be conditioned to go along with it. Once this deception is set up, it's hard to overcome it, because any attempt at overcoming it is deemed to be rebellious pride. Who are you to question this or that church leader? Indeed, since many spiritual writers had equated the essence of holiness with a total and blind obedience equivalent to a death to self, it followed that the slightest doubt or hesitation about obeying the order of a superior could be seen as selfish or even sinful. Catholics in search of spiritual perfection were trained to choke down their difficulties, stifle their supernatural common sense, the sensus fidelium, and silence the voice of their consciences. Consequently, a supreme inversion was made possible. The reception and handing on of Catholic tradition by those who still believed the faith got labeled as rebellion, and then punished as if it were truly such, while blind obedience given to ideas or ways of life contrary to our Catholic tradition was lauded and rewarded, even though objectively it imitated the rebellious pride of Satan, who hates tradition. The deception is shrewd. We all need to grow in humility, so what better way than to obediently accept whatever God's own representatives on earth demand, no questions asked? And our response will be even more meritorious, some think, if what's asked of us is repugnant to us. The more repugnant, the more meritorious. You have to admit, this is a masterful ploy for one who wishes to undermine the church. Let us contrast how God works with how Satan works. God positively wills the virtues we have. He does not will the evil of our vices. But he can make use of our vices as occasions for humiliating us and bringing us to conversion. For example, the Lord does not will the drunkenness of the drunkard, but he can make use of the drunkard's down and out despair to effect a conversion. In this way, he brings good out of evil as only God can do. In contrast, the devil positively wills the vices we have: lust, gluttony, avarice, pride. These are his stock in trade, and as long as we're acting by them, he's quite content with our performance. But for those who are not in the grip of vices, he has a more subtle strategy: to urge them to misuse their virtues. He can urge the humble to a false humility that fails to acknowledge rights and duties, or accepts humiliations that are self-destructive and destructive of those who do the humiliating. He can urge the meek to a refusal to be justly angry, a refusal to fight and resist when that would be the virtuous thing to do. He can tempt those who love the virtue of obedience to practice a blind obedience toward teachers who are teaching error or shepherds who are abusing their sheep. In themselves, humility, meekness, obedience are virtues and are therefore good, but it is in the nature of any created good to be able to be abused, and virtues too can be abused when they are misused, misapplied, misdirected. To be humble or meek by letting one's rights be dashed to the ground by another who abuses his office is to make humility or meekness an accomplice of someone else's sins. To be obedient to one who is himself disobedient to God is to become guilty of his disobedience. This is the way that the devil, when he cannot tempt someone to obvious vices, tempts them rather by the very virtues they hold dear. In this way, rather than bringing good out of evil, as God does, Satan brings evil out of good, which is his specialty. We know from Aristotle that there are two kinds of vices relative to every virtue. Thus, courage, or fortitude, is a mean or middle between the extreme of cowardice, which is a deficiency in facing danger, and the extreme of rashness, which is facing danger excessively or recklessly. However, Aristotle makes the astute observation that one of the extremes is closer to the mean and resembles it more. Thus, recklessness resembles courage more than cowardice does. And similarly, not enjoying food and drink enough is closer to temperance than gluttony is. For Aristotle, too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing, and so it is with obedience. Too much obedience paid to earthly figures, or rather an indiscriminate and total adherence to their will, is a vice. And yet it looks more like the virtuous mean than rebelliousness does, and so it tends to be confused with the virtue. So blind, indiscriminate obedience tends to be confused with true obedience, obviously much more than rebelliousness would ever be confused with it. That confusion is a key part of the strategy that I'm talking about. A book called AA 1025, Memoirs of the Communist Infiltration into the Church, gives us the posthumous memoirs of a communist agent who entered the seminary and was ordained a priest, but who all along forwarded the agenda of the communists for whom he worked, with a view to the auto-demolition of the church. That such infiltrators existed is no longer disputed. The only questions are how many there were and how high did they rise. Those who have read Malachi Martin's Windswept House and know the reporting about Cardinal Bernardin's involvement in satanic rituals will have some idea of the kind of things that happened, and in all likelihood are still happening. The editor of the AA 1025 manuscript, Marie Carré, writes, and this is a crucial sentence, "The holy virtue of obedience is today the extremely powerful weapon that our enemies, who pretend to be our friends, make use of us against what we were, to put up in its stead what they have decided to have us become." Let me just read that again. The holy virtue of obedience is today the extremely powerful weapon that our enemies, who pretend to be our friends, make use of against what we were, to put up in its stead what they have decided to have us become. Carré's assertion implies that there is an ersatz Catholicism, some call it neo-Catholicism, that our enemies seek to impose on us. Dr. Thaddeus Kaczynski has well explained what this substitute is and how it functions. Quote, "The intimate encounter with God immunizes us to nothing worship. The robust encounter with real being is the prerequisite for divine encounter, and authentic tradition enables the intelligible encounter with reality. The devil knows all this, being an expert logician, and so he desires above all the annihilation of authentic tradition. His main target, of course, is Catholic tradition, for it provides the surest means to an intimate encounter with both natural and supernatural reality. Realizing that any authentic tradition, even a barely breathing one, is a receiver and transmitter of the divine, his stroke of genius was to inspire the construction and establishment of an abstract anti-tradition that would receive and transmit nothing. Although similar in its unreality to the abstractions of communism, fascism, and Nazism, it would bear such a striking resemblance to the Christian tradition that it would escape detection. Implemented surreptitiously and cloaking itself in the form of its host, it would serve as the tradition to end all tradition. Not only would there be no counterattack this time, men of goodwill would have no idea what hit them, or even that they had been hit." Unquote. What Ryan Topping says about the vocabulary reassignment surgery, if I can put it that way, of modern times applies above all to words like obedience, tradition, and even church. Quote, "Old words that carry the gravitas of tradition and centuries of revered usage are reminted into other tokens. The reassignments will not at first be evident. To say this in other words, the meanings of terms within a counterfeit culture break down the semantic web established under the former dispensation to achieve newly desired ends. Words become weapons." So this is what happens to words like obedience, tradition, and even the word church, right? There's a kind of reassignment surgery that takes place with them. It was Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre who, on October 13th, 1974, gave the fullest and clearest exposition of this strategy that I've been describing. Quote, "Satan's master stroke will therefore be to spread the revolutionary principles introduced into the church by the authority of the church itself, placing this authority in a situation of incoherence and permanent contradiction. So long as this ambiguity has not been dispersed, disasters will multiply within the church. Satan reigns through ambiguity and incoherence, which are his means of combat and which deceive men of little faith. We must acknowledge that the trick has been well played and that Satan's lie has been masterfully utilized. The church will destroy herself through obedience. You must obey. Whom or what must we obey? We don't know exactly. Woe to the man who does not consent to this false obedience. He thereby earns the right to be trampled underfoot by its agents, to be calumniated, to be deprived of everything which allowed him to live. He is a heretic, a schismatic. Let him die. That is all he deserves. Unquote. I think that's a remarkably good description from 1974 of what we've been seeing, especially in the past 11 years. The anti-traditional actions of Pope Francis and Cardinal Roche, among others, reveal anew one of the deep sicknesses of the Roman Catholic Church on earth at this time, a multi-layered sickness that places law above persons, legalism above devotion, compliance above pastorality, uniformity above unity, micromanagement above prudence, and presentism above tradition. This sickness thrives on the blindness of blind obedience and the passivity of the laity and lower clergy. It is a sickness fed by those who tolerate it, exonerate it, or surrender to it, which they do on account of ignorance of what is at stake, laziness in pushing back, fear of consequences, opportunism, or despairing resignation. In the current assault on the immemorial Roman liturgy, blind obedience and legal positivism, the two go hand in hand, will reveal their deadliest potential as instruments by which the common good of the people of God is directly assaulted and wounded, yet under the guise of mere administrative regulation done by proper authority with proper forms. Canon law in the hands of unscrupulous ideologues too easily becomes a tool of dehumanization, depersonalization, and de-Catholicization. As a modern philosopher writes, quote, "Where was there ever a regime that did not have a host of lawyers at its disposal to help it, as it were, to legalize itself? The same lawyers who served the Revolutionary Republic in France later on worked for the Emperor Napoleon in order to create his Code Civil and to put it into practice. But even when Louis XVIII was restored to the throne, there was no lack of compliant lawyers who supported his rule by means of law, just as Napoleon's rule had earlier been supported, and just as before that, the mobs and the demagogues' reign of terror had been represented as lawful and had been advocated for by means of legal concepts. One might truly say, only lay your hands on power, on people who can construct a legal basis for your power, and you will never lack for anything. Hard and unbending in petty matters, in formalities, spineless and servile with respect to great matters, with respect to what is essential. This is how a lawyer who is a product of a law that has emancipated itself from an ethics that is itself without religion is shown to be in the light of day." Unquote. As I stated earlier, in the current attack on Catholic doctrine, morals, and worship, we are looking at nothing less than satanic evil, at a diabolic pride that seeks to cut people off from the truth, from the path to life, from sacred rituals. Is diabolic too strong a word? No. Diabolos means in Greek, the one who divides. A pope who acts against the tradition of the church and against the faithful attached to it is dividing the church from herself, dividing the faithful from what is rightfully theirs as members of the body of Christ. Is satanic too strong a word? No. Satanas means the accuser. And here we have a man, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, constantly accusing Catholics who love the Lord, love the faith, love the traditions of the church, accusing them of divisiveness, of rejecting the Holy Spirit, of rigidity, of lovelessness, of worshiping ashes, of mental illness, and on and on. Pope Francis should hold a mirror up to himself and discover the one who divides, the one who accuses. One may imagine Christ our Savior speaking to the successors of his apostles and to their compliant, manipulative, and pharisaical canon lawyers the same words he spoke to the Jewish lawyers of his day. Woe to you, lawyers, for you took away the key of knowledge. You did not enter in yourselves, and those who were entering in you hindered. Luke 11:52. Ye corrupt canon lawyers, you take away the key of the knowledge of divine worship in accord with tradition and truth. You do not enter in yourselves, and those who were entering in, young and old, singles and married, families with children, the future priestly and religious occasions, these you hindered. Ye hierarchs, you refused to humble yourselves before the truth of history, the truth of tradition, the truth of the Holy Spirit's work in the traditional movement. You failed to seek the spiritual good of the people of God, and on the contrary, you worked against their good, which is the sole justification for your authority. In the words of the book of Daniel, in the story of Susanna, iniquity came forth from Babylon from elders who were judges, who were supposed to govern the people. They perverted their minds and turned away their eyes from looking to heaven or remembering righteous judgments. That's Daniel chapter 13. As we have seen, a bishop, every bishop, including the Bishop of Rome, is entrusted with the care of the common good. That is the sole rationale for his authority. If he acts against the spiritual nourishment that the faithful receive from the old rites, if he acts against the continuity of the Church's received and approved rites, he is acting unjustly and ultra vires, beyond his authority. And any such determinations do not bind us in conscience. They bind neither the priests nor the people. Like Christ who came not to be served, like Christ who came not to be served but to serve, so too should our priests continue to serve God's people first and foremost. And the Pope, above all, is required before God to live up to his title, Servus Servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God. It is already a sign of divine mercy, of the fulfillment of God's promise that the Church would never fail until he comes again, that there are Catholics everywhere in the world, a minority to be sure, but not negligible and growing in every nation, who have been given the grace to recognize the anti-tradition for what it is and to hold fast to the tradition or to rediscover it later in life so that it may continue. Such Catholics see that many are in the grip of a distorted and harmful notion of obedience which injures the clergy even more than it does the faithful. Here is a way of testing whether you might be in the grip of it. If your concept of obedience is such that you will be ready to change all your views and practices at the whim of the Pope or the Bishop, that can only mean that your attachment is solely to obedience itself. There is no content behind it. In that case, you will never be able to truly love something, because you may be asked to reject it at any moment, and you will be expected to reject it with as much willingness as that with which you once accepted it. In other words, everything you believe, everything you do, must be held at arm's length, pinched lightly with two fingers, always ready to be dropped in favor of what they might give you tomorrow. That guarantees no assimilation, no identification, no transformation. It is the exact antithesis of how Catholics have acted with regard to the Church's faith and patrimony for all centuries. The system described here in my talk is self-perpetuating. It is designed to be unbreakable and inescapable. This destructive cycle of abusive authority and false obedience can be broken in only two ways, both of which are needed as they complement one another. The top-down solution, for which we ardently pray, or at least we should be ardently praying for it, is a future pope's root and branch reform of the Church, clearing out the episcopacy of its cowards, modernists, and homosexuals, and reinstating traditional liturgy and doctrine. Needless to say, this may require a whole series of popes, as was the case with church reform in the 16th century. It took about 10 popes to get the Counter-Reformation going, right? So we should remember that. The bottom-up solution is what clergy and laity can do right now, whoever the pope is. Exercise their God-given rights to live according to faith, reason, and tradition, ignoring penalties administered by and in service of the self-perpetuating closed system of false obedience, and thus clearing the way for the healing and rejuvenation of the church. This is not doing evil that good may come of it. It is doing good by adhering to truth and tradition and rejecting the evil of complicity with destroyers of the vineyard. One of my favorite writers from the period right after the council is the great American publisher and conservative pundit Neil McCaffrey. He lived from 1925 to 1994. Here's what he was telling his fellow Catholics when the revolution against them first erupted, and his words from 1967 ring out with a strange relevance in 2024. Quote, "Traditional Catholics find themselves bewildered, in disarray. Part of the disarray, I suspect, springs from an error most of us fell heir to. Not much burdened with a knowledge of Catholic history, we have assumed that authority could do no wrong. Well, very little wrong. Well, at least nothing seriously wrong. And so we found ourselves disarmed. I hope no one will read this appeal to nonconformity as an invitation to schism, even an oblique invitation. This is our church. Like a family, we may not always be proud of its elders or its members, but it is still ours. We owe it filial love. It is our hope. We owe it loyalty, too, and not just in fair weather. Once the loyalty came easier. Once the yoke was sweet, the burden light. Now we are in a tunnel, or rather, a madhouse. The consolations are gone. Our home is in the hands of strangers, strangers who hate us, who tell us to conform or die. Let us turn their own nonconformity against them. If they have the freedom to preach contempt of the church we know and love, surely we have the freedom to defend, to resist, to cherish what is part of ourselves. As Americans, we are accustomed to exercise generous freedoms in the temporal sphere. We are not used to having to use them in the church. Now we must, or be swept away. And the radicals do mean to sweep us away. They preach freedom, but only their own brand. They leave in their wake a totalitarian stink." Unquote. 1967. A great and courageous Dominican priest who stalwartly resisted the conciliar and post-conciliar revolution until his death in 1975, Father Roger Thomas Calmel, inspired and comforted French traditionalists with his words of wisdom. Having posed the question, "What can we do?" he writes, quote, "Obviously hold fast to tradition, be it the Mass of St. Pius V, Latin in the liturgy, the catechism, the tried and true customs of Catholic prayer, especially the rosary, and temporal Christian institutions, at least whatever remains of them. Even so doing, it is not out of the question that we may experience the temptation, what's the use? What is out of the question is that we should take this temptation seriously, or let it gain a foothold in our hearts, or impinge on our resolutions by a fraction of an inch. It is impossible to say, what's the use, when one knows that it is always good to prove to God our love, the first proof of love being to persevere in the faith and to keep Catholic tradition. All the reasons we have for losing heart, the prolonged fight, the extensive betrayal, increased isolation, should only be considered in the supreme light of faith. The greatest misfortune that could befall us is not to be bruised in the depth of our soul by the woes of the present times and the scandals from on high. It would be to lack faith, and consequently to fail to see that the Lord makes use of the present distress to urge us to turn our gaze towards Him, to invite us to show Him more than ever our trust and love. So the first thing to do is to look at the Lord, and then to keep this supernatural contemplation inseparable from consideration of the attacks to be repulsed and the struggle to be engaged till the end." Unquote. That's Father Roger Thomas Calmel in the early 1970s. May God grant us the grace to be faithful to His righteousness as taught and lived in traditional Catholicism, clear, strong, and beautiful as it is. And may He keep us from succumbing to the poisons offered by the world, including the worldliness within the Church. As the last book of the Bible exhorts us, here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Thank you for your kind attention.
And I'm not.
I'll just make a plug again for our Catholic Citizens TV website, because having sat through what we just sat through, the idea that you could possibly absorb, you know, even a portion of it as thoroughly as you might if you go back and review the video is impossible. Thank you very much. That was just outstanding. We have lots. And by the way, we try to get these videos posted several weeks after the event. We're not always quite that timely, but we are working on it. We don't want people to not come to the luncheon because we think there's added value to commingling with each other and so forth, but we do try to get them up somewhat promptly. We've got time for questions. Anyone like to pursue questions? Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question. I'd like to explain the error of positivism and positive law. You mentioned that, I think, twice.
Sure. Yes. So legal positivism is the view that all that is necessary to make a law right, I don't even know if you could say just, is that it be posited by an authority. So the authority, whenever an authority implements a law, the law has its legitimacy simply from the fact of having been posited by the authority. So, in other words, there's no other standard by which you could judge whether a law is just. It's just, quote unquote, because it simply exists, because it has been created. So the perspective of a legal positivist would imply that, let's say, if President Biden or the Congress, implements some law which, from Catholic moral point of view, we would know to be unjust, to be evil, to be illegitimate. The positivist would say, well, you still have to obey it. It's still a law. It's still a law. It's been posited. There it is, right? All that you can do is fight to overturn it. But St. Thomas Aquinas is very definitely against that position. He says every law, in order to be a law at all, has to conform to the natural moral law. The natural moral law, yeah. That is to say, it can't conflict with the Ten Commandments. It can't conflict with man's duties towards God, and so forth.
I'm sorry, did you say you had some relation with Wyoming Catholic College?
Yes, I was one of the people who helped found it.
Because our December 2nd fundraisers past December, we honored Bishop Rickett, and I had picked up the president and chancellor at the airport, the current one right now. So,
great.
So I'm very familiar with them now because I got to drive around on it. But,
wonderful.
So I was wondering, in what respect is renewing Catholic education at all levels, from grade school to university level, role play in this, and can we sue Catholic institutions for not being fully Catholic and whatnot, or false advertising or fraud?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I mean, as a longtime educator, I mean, I was a university level professor for 20 years, and I've worked with many wonderful young people. That was a major part of my life and something that I threw myself into passionately. And I will say that education is transformative. I mean, it for better or for worse, it makes people who they are. Homeschooling does that in one way. Public schools do that in another way, And there really it's not possible, in fact, for human beings to grow up without needing education. Even if they never go to a formal school, they're going to be formed. Education is formation. The children of medieval peasants who learned how to farm and build and so on, they were being given a different kind of education. Everybody has to be educated. So the quality of education is one of those questions that is as basic as, air to breathe and water to drink, right? It's that important of a concern. It has to be right on the list after bare survival, and so I'm very much convinced. You won't be surprised to hear this, given my background. I have a strong conviction in favor of liberal education, in the old sense of the word, classical education, some people say, to avoid confusion. Great books, the great books approach. I think that, speaking for myself, it was years and years of reading, studying, and discussing the great authors of the Western intellectual tradition, and especially of the Catholic Church. St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, right? But also Aristotle, Plato. These are the authors who opened my eyes to a different way of thinking than the way the modern relativistic liberal world thinks, right? So I'm very passionate about that, and I think every Catholic, to the extent possible, and there are different ways of doing this. There's self-education, there are online courses, there are obviously Chesterton academies, there are homeschool programs, Mother of Divine Grace. There are so many different things out there, but we all need to keep educating ourselves in the great sources of our tradition. Because when the quality of the old great authors is something that is almost incomparable, and the wisdom there is indescribable. But it's perfectly obvious, to just address briefly your other question, that Catholic institutions that are not officially committed to the Catholic faith in all of the dimensions of their programs and their curriculum and so on should definitely not have the name Catholic. And bishops, some bishops have been good about demanding that places shape up or ship out, but a lot of but for decades there's been a lot of toleration of this kind of nonsense, right? And it's actually, sometimes the bishops will say, well, we don't want to kick them out. We want to kind of work with them and try. No, just say be Catholic, or or you're not Catholic, and no false advertising here. We don't need false advertising.
I just wanted the question and the answer reminded me of a remark that one of our prior speakers made. I don't remember who it was, but it really struck me at the time. He said basically, look, if you try to improve your parish, you try to improve the Mass, you try to improve whatever, and you just fail, don't stay. Go find one that works. And with our children, it seems like we're even more compelled to go find a school that works or a system that works, because they're going to, as you say, they're going to get educated one way or the other. They're going to grow up. Time doesn't wait. And so to the extent any of you have children or grandchildren who you have influence over and they're struggling in their current schools, get them out. And even if if you have to drive hours each day to get them to a good school, do it before it's too late. And that's just my 2 cents. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm hearing that Francis may and his people in the Curia may try to abrogate quo primum as a way of disestablishing the traditional Mass. Would you say that if quo primum is abrogated, that the law of tradition would continue to maintain the status of the traditional Mass
Yes.
in the Church?
I will. So really, the question pertains to a document called Quo Primum, a papal bull issued by Pope St. Pius V in 1570. I mentioned it in my talk once or twice. But the importance of this papal bull is that Pius V says that he's promulgating this new edition of the Roman Missal, the Missale Romanum, and that everybody, basically, if you're already using the Roman Rite, you have to use this new Missal, this new edition of the Missal. It's a very old Missal. I'll talk about that in a second. But and if you're not using it, but you want to use it, then you can have a unanimous vote with your bishop and his cathedral canons, and they can adopt this Missal. So it has various provisions like that. And it also concludes by saying every priest forever and ever has the right to use this Missal, right? So it's a very important document, and it's one that traditionalists frequently refer to. But I think that it's often misunderstood, and it's misunderstood precisely by legal positivists, because they see it as, Pius V, just simply willed that everybody use this Missal, but some other pope could will that they use some other Missal. But that's not at all what happened if you study the matter. What Pius V was trying to do is find the most orthodox and traditional rite in Christendom, which he, I think, logically enough said, well, the rite that the church in Rome has been using is a good candidate for that. For centuries and centuries, the church in Rome had been using this rite. And his revision of it was simply to remove errors of transmission that had taken place through manuscript copying and printing in order to restore to its pristine condition a traditional rite that was already millennial by the time he did this. So what Pius V, so far from giving it authority by the document, he was recognizing the inherent authority of the tradition and putting all of his papal might behind that, right? And so to that extent, it's not as if the Tridentine Mass or any of the Tridentine liturgy has authority simply because the Pope said it. Rather, the Pope said what he did because he recognized this liturgy as having authority, right? So it's primary authority. And so, but just to get to the rumor, I don't believe that Pope Francis would do that. I mean, he could, and it wouldn't stop the traditionalist movement from continuing for the reasons I was giving. But I hear a lot of rumors all the time, you know, just because of people sending me information, and I've developed a pretty good sense of which rumors have you know, real backing and which ones don't, and that one strikes me as really far out. I'm not saying it couldn't happen theoretically, but it doesn't seem too likely to me. That is, this regime, this current regime seems to proceed more on the basis of pressure and fear and things like that, not through legal mechanisms of that sort.
Marianne?
It seems to me the Pope has a particular antagonism toward Americans, the American Church, the Catholics in America. And I'm wondering where that comes about, because actually the church in America is thriving compared to a lot of the European churches and the German churches over the hill, actually.
Yes.
Even they've been corrected by the Pope. But I don't understand the antagonism that he has toward America. Supposedly he had never been to the United States before he became Pope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I mean, it seems like a lot of it just has to do with, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I've been told by people who are experts that there's a very strong anti-American feeling in Latin America that is heavily connected with liberation theology and with their tendency towards Marxism. You know, not that they embrace all of Marxism, but they certainly embrace some aspects of it. And so they're anti-capitalism, anti-democracy. They think of America as being rich, self-satisfied, and basically fattening itself on the spoils of the rest of the world. And also they will tend to think of America as ideologically trying to influence everybody else all the time. Now, I will say there is some truth to some of these things. I mean, there is a little bit of truth there are ways in which America historically has tried to force itself on other people and intervene in everybody's backyard and say, this is the way you have to run your government. And it has often caused catastrophe. I mean, this is just a fact. But it still doesn't justify this really negative attitude because, you know, rather what should be said is, regardless of whatever mistakes you've made or regardless of whatever excesses there might be in your enthusiasms, nevertheless, you have many virtues, you have many great qualities. The Catholic Church is stronger in your country. The people are very generous. You know, Americans give much more of their wealth to the poor and to charities and to churches than anybody else in the rest of the world by a long shot, right? So there's so much that could be praised legitimately about America that it ends up sounding like sour grapes. Like, you know, what's the bee in your bonnet? Why are you saying these things, right? So that's my couple of thoughts on that.
It's the worst possible system in the world except for any alternative.
Yeah.
So I would have a slight disagreement because I don't get the impression that Francis is upset with American authorities, but rather with Americans, ordinary Americans. So I think there's a hypothesis that Americans are too rebellious, naturally. And I actually agree, Americans are too rebellious. Except that if you're an American Catholic, I think that's good compromise, because then you have the two. But I think that's the reason. Americans are perceived that true in Latin America as people who think they know everything and are arrogant. And American government is kind of justified because they have the power, but they're arrogant. And of course, I come from another country, and I grew up in Poland. I would actually say that I tell my foreign students that Americans and non-Americans are very different and unaware of the difference. Although the non-Americans usually more arrogant about it. Not Americans. It's the non-Americans that are more arrogant. So I think that it's this satisfaction with Americans who think that they can do what they set out to be, no matter what. It's not true completely, but it's much more true than they tend to admit. But I have two commentaries. Quick, I would ask you please to add Dan Scotus to the list as the core. Dan Scotus has to be with.
Oh, Dan Scotus,
Dan Scotus has to be on that list. And the second thing that I would like to suggest from the Polish traditions, Americans are rebellious, and it's part of the reason why Americans are so unhappy about it, because they feel a lot like they're under foreign rule or alien rule. We feel like that in the church too. So the Polish tradition for 123 years, Poland didn't exist, was under hostile and extremely alien rule. And it survived because, to semi-quote Star Trek, resistance is fertile. Resistance works. And we should learn.
Yes, I agree. Well, as one of Polish extraction myself, I applaud everything you're saying. The history of Poland, if you want to read the ultimate history of the underdog, Poland is the Polish history is the talk about resilience there and resistance. And of course, there's always been a very good collaboration between Poland and the United States, too. It occurs to me just briefly that maybe a way of putting it is to say that Francis seems to be operating on the basis of a certain caricature of Americans in America. And caricatures have a basis in truth. I mean, that's what makes a caricature is that you can recognize it as based on something that's there, but it's distorted, right? It's exaggerated. Usually for comical effects. In this case, it's unfortunately not comic, but so I think that's what may be going on there.
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the Mission of Divine Mercy? It's a small order in San Antonio, Texas, because there's a big issue on obedience kind of there.
Yes, I'm actually going to San Antonio in a couple of weeks to give some talks, and I'm a bit nervous about that actually because among other things, there's a visionary down there. There's somebody who's claiming to have received visions, and he's claiming that he's being told, not to obey the bishop and not to obey. I think maybe Traditionis Custodes or something like that. And what makes me uncomfortable about a situation like that is not that I disagree that there are reasons why we need to resist and not follow certain policies, but it shouldn't be grounded in somebody's private revelations. That's a red flag as far as I'm concerned. And most of the saints would say the same thing. They would say, if you think you're getting private revelations, don't publish them on the internet. Just keep them to yourself. Talk to your spiritual director about them. And some of the greatest saints we have, some of the greatest mystics, like Saint Teresa of Avila, probably the best example. She would tell what she was experiencing to her spiritual director, and they usually told her to keep a lid on it and not talk to anybody about it, right? And sometimes there were even examples. I think this was true. I think it was Venerable Mary of Agreda, but similar kind of situation, where she, I think a spiritual director told her to write her autobiography, and she did. And then another spiritual director afterwards said, you should destroy it, and she did. And then another one told her she needed to write it again, and she did it, right? So, and then this was long before, word processors and backup drives and so on. And so my point being that I would honestly just say people really need to be very careful about following anything that claims to be a revelation. I mean, it's not that there can't be legitimate private revelations, it's just that that's never the main reason why we should do or think something, right? This is why we have scripture, this is why we have tradition, this is why we have, the fathers and doctors of the church, we have the mystics, we have, and then we have good magisterial teaching. There's so much we can rely on that we don't need to rely on something like that, which is so inherently unstable and can really go wrong, right?
of advice for those of us who have in-laws, no convert to the faith, a man in his 50s? Any words of advice to help us guide them who get confused or befuddled or even scandalized with what our current Pope may say?
So you're talking about people who,
New to the faith.
right, so they know there's something wrong with what Pope Francis is doing, but they don't know how to process it.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, I mean, that's a really good question, and I know that different people are helped by different things, which is why it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer. But I often find that Bishop Schneider's books are really, really helpful for people to read. In particular, his book, Christus Vincit, is just a marvelously refreshing book. He speaks with such humility and honesty and such clarity about what's going on, that on the one hand, he tells you what's wrong and why it's happening, but on the other hand, he never comes across as full of sour grapes and full of, or full of anger and venom. He just comes across as somebody who's extremely calm about everything and just sees with the vision of a prayerful and wise person. And I like that because somebody can read that and they can feel sort of reassured, like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. Like, what I see as wrong really is wrong. There really is something there. But then they have a better understanding of why it's wrong and why it's happening. Instead of it just seeming like some kind of totally irrational phenomenon. It is an irrational phenomenon, but I mean even irrational phenomena have causes that you can understand, and that makes it somehow easier to confront. The real difficulty, I think, in our time, well, there's a multi-pronged difficulty. One is that because of the last 11 years, and it's not just the last 11 years, there are problems beginning well before that, but it's a very acute problem in the last 11 years, that people who are serious spiritual seekers, who are open to Christianity or open to Catholicism, are often scandalized by what's happening, and they're turned away from the truth. And that's very, very tragic. That's a tragic thing. But there's also the problem of people who might have converted or might have listened to the church, let's say liberal or progressive types who maybe are doubting their worldview a little bit, but they feel somehow emboldened by Pope Francis, or at least and by the court around him, to say, oh, well, actually, what I believe isn't so bad after all. I can just keep being a happy liberal or a happy progressive or whatever. So that's very, very scandalous. And then of course it makes us look bad when we point out the problems. And so that's exactly the reason why we need to really reflect on these questions. And Bishop Schneider is an outstanding figure for that.
I have a simple question, I think. So what about, I've been in little meetings, that kind of thing, of us little people, that where the discussion has been towards, Pope Francis is being used. What's coming out of his mouth is not really what he believes, but what he's been forced to say. Is that a possibility?
Well, I don't think it really is. I think that there was a tendency for a while, especially in the first few years of his pontificate, to bend over backwards to give him the benefit of the doubt, and to assume that if he said or did anything that seemed problematic, it was because it was somebody else's fault. I think and that's a natural tendency. We want to do that towards authority figures. But I think there's just too much of a habitual record. There's a record that is sort of day in, day out of his appointments, who he makes bishops, who he elevates, how he guides the synods, all these sorts of things, where it's very much like he is in control of these processes. So, if there's somebody out there secretly blackmailing him or something, that might be true. We're not going to know that, but it doesn't really seem to match the facts that we have access to.
Yes, I have a friend who's probably your #1 fan, has all your books and comments on all your Facebook posts mostly.
Why isn't they here?
Because, anyway, don't interrupt me, please. Yes, takes his son to Catholic school. The students attend Mass every rather than go with his son. So much so that even the son doesn't want to receive communion because the classmates receive in their hand. So it's almost he's agreeing with scandalous behavior. And I don't know, I guess for myself, I don't know what to think about that. I would have a hard time praying the TLM at home when, I mean, Jesus is there in the tabernacle, right?
Yeah. It's a very painful situation that you're outlining there, that we're just dealing with in general, because there is such a deep rupture between the old and the new rites. And the rupture shows itself, I mean, it's less visible at a place like St. John Cantius, where they bring the mentality of the old liturgy into the new one as completely as possible. But let's be honest, that's very rare. That's not the way it is in most places. And the differences can be not just superficial differences, but even something like how communion is received. I wrote a book about this called The Holy Bread of Eternal Life, where I go into great detail about all the things that are wrong with receiving communion in the hand, and many, many problems that that brings with it, including the serious risk of sacrilege. And so I think that it's because our Lord is present that we need to be especially careful about what we seem to be approving and what we seem to be accepting. And so I'm not one of those who says, because Jesus is there, therefore you should go. I'm more inclined to say, the fact that our Lord is there makes it worse that certain things are being done to him. And to the faithful who don't know better but are being badly formed by this. And so I sympathize with somebody. I mean, I myself, I can't go to the Novus Ordo anymore. I mean, I can't do it. I haven't done it for years. I mean, and this is after, and I always say to people, this is after I spent decades doing sacred music for the Novus Ordo. I mean, I was not some kind of like sedevacantist from the cradle. I mean, I was doing everything I could to improve the Novus Ordo, but I reached a point where I just said, I can't do this anymore. It's sort of like, it really is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You know, there's a sense in which you feel like it's just always a sinking ship, no matter how hard you try. So I don't know, that's not really an answer to your question. I'm just saying I think we need to respect people who have reached the point where they can't go anymore, and we need to understand that that's a reasonable position to arrive at.
Follow-up is, what about Jesus in the tabernacle? If he is there to witness the offenses made, then why couldn't he be with him there?
I mean, I would say if you find yourself in a situation like that, you can certainly adore him and make reparation, but I'm not sure that one should actively put oneself in that position, right? Because after all, the liturgy is mainly to glorify and honor God. So the way it's done should be done in such a way that it is honoring and glorifying God. And if we can't actually help it to be that way, then maybe we don't have any business being there. Yeah.
Maybe one or two more, then we'll.
I would like to say that Pope Francis once said that he wasn't afraid of schism. True liturgy was schismatics. And I want to know if it's we aren't very free.
Right. Well, I kind of addressed that in my talk when I talked about the church and the anti-church and and when I quoted Father Thomas Weinandy. I mean, if you know who Father Thomas Weinandy is, he used to be the head of the Department for Doctrine for the USCCB. So this is, again, not some kind of crazed, rad trad, but he's like very mainstream, and actually not a fan of the TLM either. But, he said Pope Francis is effectively the head of two churches, of the true church, like ex officio, and of a false church because of false doctrine. That was amazing when he said that. He got in a lot of trouble for saying that, I can assure you. So, yeah, I mean, of course, those who continue to hold and practice the Catholic faith will never be schismatics. A schismatic, by definition, is somebody who leaves the church and who leaves what Christ founded and established. And I mean, it is true that there are some traditionalists who are tempted to schism. There are some Catholics who are tempted to become Eastern Orthodox because of the grass is always greener on the other side phenomenon, right? And like, oh, look at those Orthodox, they haven't changed their liturgy in 1,000 years. Yeah, well, they also haven't gotten along with one another for 1,000 years either, you know? I mean, there are many, many problems with the Eastern Orthodox, and I actually think that the strengths and weaknesses of East and West are almost inverse images of each other. That is, I won't go into this right now, but I think that, you know, I very much pray for the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches because the church should be Catholic all over the world, and it's a terrible thing that the East and the West are separated like this. So schism, but I don't think we're not in danger of schism. Just like the Japanese Christians, when, you know, the famous hidden Christians who held on to their faith for 250 years without any clergy, during the period of persecution of Catholicism there, they remained true to the faith. And when the missionaries came back after all that time, they found these hidden Christians, and they were still Catholics, right? So you can actually even be Catholic, even if the hierarchy disappeared from your area for a time, you know. I mean, I don't expect that to happen, but I'm just saying, you know, in an extreme case, these Japanese Christians in history give us an example of fidelity. Yeah, one last thing.
I have a question about Pius V. I have some friends that are going over to Pius V. So that was news to me. I guess, can you just give a brief explanation? And then finally, are those sacraments valid, the priest of Pius V?
So you're talking about the Society of St. Pius V?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I will admit up front, I haven't really made a careful study of them, but the things that I've heard make me nervous. Maybe I should just leave it at that. I would have to study a lot more before I could give you a really well-formed answer.
One more question. I think it's good to learn to be able to explain the faith. I like Patrick Madrid. I like the way, his whole demeanor. But can you recommend a few books, or do you have a list of books somewhere online that you could recommend for people that really want to learn how to explain their faith, about the traditions of the faith and what's going on in the world today? I mean, you mentioned Bishop Athanasius, but
yes.
I mean, are there others, like Peter Priest?
Yes. Well, I mean, there are a lot of good Catholic writers. I mean, I'm not saying that one would necessarily agree with everything they say or the way that they say everything, but I've enjoyed a lot of books by Scott Hahn over the years. He's a friend of mine. He's a very traditional person. Most people know by now that he goes to the Latin Mass, and he's not afraid of saying so. Peter Kreeft is good. He can be a little bit loosey-goosey at times. But he's, and then but there's an article at 1 Peter 5 by a fellow named Aaron Seng, S-E-N-G. It's got a funny title. It's called "Exiting Squishy Church" is what it's called. So by squishy church, he kind of means in a funny way what I was calling the anti-church. But it's a reading list. It's like 40 recommended books about traditional Catholicism. And it's from a few years ago, so I would add more things that have appeared since then, but it's a very good list. It's got all the classics on it. So.
How about Brant Petrie?
Oh, Brant Petrie is very good at what he does. I personally think he would be worlds better if he would open himself to tradition, and if he is so good at what he does that he would be even better if he understood how much of what he's arguing is actually found in the old liturgy and is missing from the new liturgy. He seems only to know the new liturgy, so that's a weakness with him. But it doesn't actually invalidate what he says.
Who was the name?
Brant Petrie, P-I-T-R-E.
We're going to break out the formal part of our program because we have to videograph and so forth. But Peter has very graciously agreed to continue to answer questions over by where the books are being sold, and at least for a little while. I don't know. Yeah. Sure. So if you have questions still, please feel free to see Peter. In answer to the question about the good authors, I have to plug our CatholicCitizens.com website. We have something called Catholic Views, and we see a lot of articles by a wide variety of Catholic writers that are relatively coherent. I always have to find the right way to describe it, because I don't want to get into the liberal and conservative and all that. But there's a lot of interesting articles in there about books that come out, reviewing the books, or just opinion pieces by authors who have written books. So again, I urge you to take a look at the website for that kind of stuff. And we also have a pretty detailed index at this point of topics. If there's a particular topic you want to look up, you can do that on the site. Thank you very much for coming. I hope those of you who have just started coming to these luncheons continue and bring friends, and let's make it a bigger party every time. Okay? Thank you very much.